Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Brothers and sisters and friends, does science negate religion? Does science contradict religion? Can science disprove religion? These are very important questions in the 21st century. And to be very honest, this topic is a hot potato. When you're holding a hot potato, you want to drop it. However, I think we can easily address these questions by talking about the philosophy of science. In the philosophy of science, we have something called induction. And this is something that science uses all the time. It uses induction or the inductive inference. What is induction? Induction is a thinking process where you move from the known to the unknown, okay? So induction is a thinking process where you move from the known to the unknown. You have limited set of observations and you conclude for something you haven't observed, which is the next observation or the entire set of observations. Let me give you an example. Imagine we go to the United Kingdom and we go to a country in the United Kingdom called Wales. And Wales is known for its many sheep. And we ask a question, what are the color of sheep? And we start looking at sheep and we start recording the color. So I've observed the first sheep and it's white. I've observed the 100th sheep and it's white. I've observed the 10,000th sheep and it's white. I've observed the 1,000,000th sheep and it's white. So I stop there. I've got enough observations, 1,000,000 sheep, and they all happen to be white. So what do? I conclude for the next sheep that I haven't observed. And my conclusion is, given the fact that I've observed 1,000,000 white sheep, then the next sheep is going to be white. I can even say, therefore, all sheep are white. This exposes a problem, which is now known as the problem of induction, which is that we can never be certain using inductive inferences or using induction as a thinking process. Why? Because you can have another observation that can contradict your current conclusions based on the limited observations you have had. And that is very critical because we know that there are some sheep that are black. So even though that you've observed 1,000,000 white sheep and you conclude that the next sheep that you haven't observed yet is going to be white, even though you've observed all of those sheep, and you're making that valid conclusion from the point of view that it's a valid inference to make, you could still be wrong. Because you can have another observation that contradicts your conclusions that's based on limited observations. And this is the beauty of science. It's supposed to progress. It's not supposed to give you 100% certainty. It's supposed to move forward. Even the evangelical atheist, Richard Dawkins, he says in his book, A Devil's Chaplain, and I'm paraphrasing, that in a few years' time, our understanding of Darwinism may totally change to the point that we may get rid of it completely based on new evidence. What Dawkins is doing is echoing the problem of induction. We may have another observation or many observations that can contradict our current conclusions that's based on limited data. That is the problem of induction, because it will never lead to certainty. We may always change our conclusions. And I would argue it's not a problem, it's the beauty. It's the beauty of science. Now you have to appreciate something here. I am not talking about direct observations. I'm not saying you've seen one white sheep, therefore you conclude, I've seen one white sheep. That's a direct observation. That could be certain because you've seen X, therefore X. You've seen one white sheep, therefore there is one white sheep. You've seen 5 white sheep, therefore there are 5 white sheep. That's a certain conclusion. This is not induction. This is not science. This is just direct observation. When we're talking about science, we're talking about multiple observations, and we're using those multiple observations to infer. We make the inductive inference. We make a conclusion for things that we haven't observed. That is something very important. Or we make a conclusion about the connections between these different observations. And these connections or these laws or this kind of understanding of how we understand all of the data may be wrong. So there is a difference between a direct observation and the inductive inference or induction as science uses it. Okay, so it's very important to understand. So how does this relate to our question of, does science go against religion? Well, it makes us understand the epistemic value, the epistemic weight of scientific conclusions, which is that they are never going to be 100% certain. That's very important for you to understand in order for us to continue this intellectual journey. The other point you need to understand is, even if a scientific conclusion or a scientific theory works, it doesn't mean it's absolutely true. It's a logical fallacy to claim that just because this scientific theory and conclusion is working, therefore it must be absolutely true. That's not the case. It's fallacious. And we know in the history of science that to be the case. For example, in the 1700s, they had this idea, this theory called the theory of phlogiston. When something burns, a combustible thing burns, it produces phlogisticated air. In 1773 or around that period, Dan Rutherford used that workable theory and he discovered nitrogen, the truth of nitrogen. But later on, we found out that phlogiston was false. What does this teach us? It teaches us you can get a truth from a workable theory that is false. So it doesn't follow just because something is working that it is true. And this is why we have to really understand that just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. And as we mentioned previously, that the epistemic weight of scientific conclusions are that they are not 100% certain by virtue of the problem of induction. So you've got some tools at your disposal now to answer the question. So when we say, does science contradict religion, what do we mean? Do we mean direct observations? I agree with you. If there is a direct observation and you cannot reconcile it with the religious text, then we know we have a problem. Because if a religious text says there are no trees on planet Earth, and we both agree with what the term tree means and what trees look like, then we know we have a problem because we can actually directly observe trees on planet Earth. So we could easily reject that religious claim. But we're not talking about direct observations. Because when it comes to the Quranic point of view, when it comes to the Quran, there is nothing that we observe with our naked eye. There's nothing that we observe directly in the known cosmos and universe that contradicts Quranic claims. One may argue, though, that some scientific conclusions and theories that's based on induction may contradict Quranic claims. Maybe. Let's take, for example, the Darwinian mechanism. I'm not going to go into the debate about can we reconcile the Darwinian mechanism, the Darwinian evolution with the Quran. I'm not going to go into that discussion. Let's assume there is no reconciliation. Let's assume, just for the purposes of understanding this question and answering this question. Let's assume that common ancestry, which is a key pillar of the Darwinian mechanism, key pillar of Darwinian evolution, this contradicts the Quran. Let's assume that. Is this enough now to say that science negates, contradicts, or can disprove religion? No. Why? Because, and we've mentioned this in another video, and there's lots of evidence to show this, that the Quran is from God. So what is the epistemic weight of Quranic knowledge? Generally speaking, the epistemic weight of Quranic knowledge is absolutely true because it's come from the knowing, the wise. Al-Hakim, the wise. Al-Alim, the knowing. God has the totality of wisdom and knowledge. We just have particulars. We have a pixelated understanding of reality. God has the picture. We have just a pixel, if that. So when God claims something and we understand what that claim means, that's why I mentioned the word generally speaking, because sometimes we don't know what the Quran says properly because we don't use our brains and we don't access the intellectual classical tradition, but that's another discussion. But once we know what the Quran says, then we know it's true by virtue of the fact of who it's come from. It's come from the knowing and the wise. So the epistemic weight of Quranic claims are absolutely true. The epistemic weight of scientific claims are not absolutely true by virtue of what we've just discussed in the philosophy of science. Just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. And the problem of induction, that you can have another observation that can contradict your current conclusions that was based on limited observations. So it can change. Even Richard Dawkins said this. So there's not much of a problem. Scientific theories and claims may contradict religion, like in this case, but it's not enough to negate religion and completely say we shouldn't believe in this divine book. Why? Because of the tools in the philosophy of science that I've just given you. That just because something works, it doesn't mean it's absolutely true. And the problem of induction. I remember having this discussion in London with somebody. I mentioned something, they said, oh, the Quran says this about natural phenomena. Now, I didn't want to get into the debate about his understanding of what the Quran says. I basically said to him, well, can your understanding of science change? Can you have a future observation or another observation that contradicts your current conclusions that's based on limited data? Yes. So what's the problem? And then he just basically agreed with me from that point of view, from what I remember. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing, it was a while ago, but I think you get the point. So when we want to ask the question about does science negate religious claims, well, we have to understand what do we mean by science. If it's a direct observation, then fine. There's an argument there, because if you've directly observed something and it contradicts some claims in religious scripture, then there's a problem if you cannot reconcile the two. Obviously, you have to go through reconciliation because you have to understand what they both really mean, but that's a different topic. However, if you mean scientific theories, even well-confirmed theories, and well-established theories, and scientific conclusions, that's not enough to negate religion, because the epistemic weight of scientific theories and conclusions are not absolutely true by virtue of what we've just discussed in the philosophy of science. But religious claims, especially when it comes to the Quran, is absolutely true because it's come from the absolute, it's come from the all-knowing, the all-wise. Obviously, that assumes that you've understood what the Quran actually says, but that's a different discussion. But this is a discussion based on principles, so you understand that if one day you're interested in religion and you find out that a particular theory in the scientific domain of knowledge goes against the Quranic claim, then it shouldn't really agitate you intellectually by virtue of the epistemic weight of both claims. One's from God, and we could show how it's from God, and one is from science, and we've seen that it's not supposed to give you absolute certainty. It's supposed to move forward, it's supposed to progress from that point of view. And there is a bigger discussion to have about religious claims, especially Quranic claims. Are they supposed to give you detailed evidence concerning science? My position is no, that's not the whole point of the Quran. The whole point of the Quran, when it alludes to natural phenomena, is to agitate within you and evoke within you an understanding that the divine exists and He is worthy of worship, and there is a divine wisdom pervading the universe, which should really evoke within us an understanding that He is worthy of worship. So the Quran is pointing to a direction. These are ayat, these are signs to point you to a direction, and irrespective of your scientific knowledge or the knowledge of what you're being pointed to or pointed towards, irrespective of your knowledge, it could be primitive, it could be advanced, irrespective, you're going to conclude that there is a divine wisdom that is worthy of worship. The Quranic discourse is not really there to give you these details, but that's a different topic. But I wanted to mention that to get you thinking further. To cut the long story short, does science negate religion? No, it doesn't, because of the problem of induction and the epistemic weight of scientific theories and conclusions, and the epistemic weight of revelation, Quranic conclusions. I hope this helps you in your journey.